Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event. My name is Maura Johnson, and I'm the Head of Secretariat for the Voluntary Principles. December 2020 marks the 20th anniversary of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. To kick off our celebrations, I'm absolutely delighted that we are presenting this webinar featuring an illustrious panel who will speak on the theme of looking back 20 years of the Voluntary Principles. It's a huge pleasure for me to introduce the moderator who will lead this event, Edward Bickham. Edward has worked in government as a special advisor to UK Foreign and Home Secretaries. He's worked in the business sector in media, communications, and mining, including as Executive Vice President for External Affairs at Anglo American. Edward was involved in creating the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EITI, as part of the original advisory board, and then was on the board. He was also part of the multi-stakeholder steering committee for the OECD's responsible sourcing work and a member of the steering board for the UK's OECD National Contact Point. Some years ago, Edward led Anglo's adoption and implementation of the Voluntary Principles, and he served in this initiative as a member of the steering committee. He also delivered the keynote speech for the UK hosted plenary in 2015. So it's a great pleasure. Edward, I'll turn this over to you to moderate and lead this event. Thank you.
Maura, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the Secretariat for setting up a discussion around the VPs over the last 20 years. We couldn't always be sure that we would arrive after 20 years, but I think things are looking a good deal more solid and positive. And one of the reasons for that is to discuss what we tried to do from the beginning, what we've learned in the meantime. And let me start by introducing our four panelists. The man who should come first is Bennett Freeman, who will be known to many of the attendees as very much a leading thinker on the whole issue of corporate responsibility, sustainability, and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Rights at the State Department, really led the work that led to the Voluntary Principles. And he has since then been involved in a whole raft of approaches, both as a key person at Calvert Investment and indeed chairing the advisory board for Global Witness and being an influential person in the consulting world, including carrying out one of the first human rights impact assessments. And we'll come back to Bennett very soon. Arvind Ganesan, also a well-known figure in this area, Director of the Business Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. He leads the organization's work to expose human rights abuses linked to business and other economic activities, hold institutions accountable, and he was very much involved at the beginning of the Voluntary Principles and is a member of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable. Anton Mifsud-Bonnici describes himself as an ESG master strategist, and he has indeed a very distinguished career in a whole range of ESG related issues, and was involved from an early stage in the implementation and design from his position at BP of the VPs. He's a strategist and advocate on issues such as governance, supply chain, due diligence and risk management, land access and government affairs, as well as being involved over many years in the implementation of the Voluntary Principles. And last and certainly not least is Justine Nolan, who carries the title Professor, which makes it clear that we should treat her with the greatest respect. Justine is an expert on addressing modern slavery and has recently published on that topic, and her involvement with the VPs goes back to the early years when she was involved with being Director of Business Human Rights at the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, which then morphed into being Human Rights First. She works with civil society, government, and companies on business and human rights issues. Welcome, Justine. And I'm not quite sure what time of day it is for you in Australia, but thank you for accommodating the rest of the world today. So let me, without further ado, quote the first line of L.P. Hartley's book, The Go-Between, which says, "The past is a different country. They do things differently there." And I think when we look back to the late 1990s, it is perhaps difficult from the perspective of 2020 to remember how polarized a lot of the discussion was between civil society and companies. There was mutual incomprehension, no real agreement on the boundaries of corporate responsibility, and this was that incomprehension led to a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of the difficulties that I think infected the dialogue around key issues such as human rights. And the Voluntary Principles was one of the early attempts to try and establish what the common ground should be as a basis for establishing good practice and for spreading that out. Now, in going to the panel, let me start with Bennett. The original title for the Voluntary Principles was the US-UK Voluntary Principles, and clearly Bennett at the State Department played a key role. Bennett, would you like to introduce the discussion by talking about why you got involved and what you thought would emerge from the dialogue?
Thanks, Edward, and thanks to you and Maura, and to everyone participating today for the chance to offer some reflections 20 years on. Before I talk about the State Department perspective that I brought to the table really beginning in 1999, I just want to pick up on Edward's apt observation that dialogue between companies and NGOs was a very difficult area 2 decades ago. And in fact, for some companies, some industries, hardly existing at all. And not just mutual misunderstanding or incomprehension, but an unwillingness really to engage and to listen and to learn and understand and respect different perspectives. And it was a willingness, though, to come together to do exactly that really laid the basis for what became the Voluntary Principles, launched on December 20, 2000. This initiative, like just about anything that any of us does, takes so many different people and perspectives. Fortunately, people at 2 companies in particular in the late 90s, BP and Shell, had been thinking about issues very specifically around security forces in conflict zones in countries like Nigeria, Indonesia, and Colombia. People in NGOs, just a couple, but Arvind Ganesan, I think foremost among them, just as a kid at the time at Human Rights Watch, had done a brief paper looking at these problems with oil companies in Colombia, work by others at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty. But the UK piece was very, very important here. And I came into the job with the long title that Edward referenced in his introduction in early 1999 with a broad responsibility to manage the State Department's bilateral human rights diplomacy around the world. But I also came with a interest in corporate responsibility and a sense that the whole agenda was emerging into the mainstream, and there really were opportunities to bring different actors, particularly companies and governments and NGOs, together using the convening power of governments. And I sensed, as I began to develop the ideas in the spring of 1999 that then launched the dialogue and negotiation process in the year 2000 that produced the VPs, that there was a lot of thinking and learning from difficult events in the UK in particular. And with all due respect to the US side of the Atlantic, with the exception of Arvind and a couple people and a couple of companies, the thinking was much more advanced on the UK side of the Atlantic. And for that reason, I thought it was important to start a dialogue on a joint US-UK basis. And I felt it was especially important to bring into the room, using the convening power of the State Department and the Foreign Office, the US oil and mining companies together with Shell, BP, and Rio Tinto, because those three UK companies had started having conversations with the NGOs around human rights in general and conflict zones and security forces in particular. And I felt that the initial comfort in having some tough discussions on the part of the British companies might rub off on the American companies who'd had few, if any, of such conversations. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of doing the VPs initially on a US-UK basis. I wish that we had been able to do them at the time on a more global basis, but we had calendar and resource and political and diplomatic constraints that we worked with. I'll just end my opening reflections just by making the observation that from the perspective of two decades ago, the VPs were a big undertaking, quite challenging, very innovative at the time. The only real model or precedent that we had for a multi-stakeholder initiative bringing together disparate actors was the Fair Labor Association, which had also been spawned by the Clinton administration several years earlier, working with footwear and apparel companies, as well as with labor and human rights NGOs. And Justine Nolan was part of that process, and she'll speak to it, no doubt, in a few minutes, but it was just important to have her in the original Voluntary Principles process to help inform our idea of what a multi-stakeholder initiative could be. But our whole objective in the year 2000 was to bring the actors together to create a global standard that could then be the basis of the baseline for human rights accountability around a very, very specific set of issues. And I'll just end by saying that what made the process work was bringing together those actors in what looked and felt at times like the original famous Star Wars bar scene of aliens from different galaxies who had never been in the bar together, to bring them together and to reach an understanding of each other's fundamental perspectives and bottom lines. And what it made the whole thing work was the NGOs recognizing the legitimacy and necessity of security arrangements for the companies in conflict zones, and the corollary recognition, acceptance by the companies that those security arrangements had to be based on serious human rights safeguards. It was that reciprocal understanding and commitment that we reached after months of discussion, debate, negotiation, argument, but then consensus that laid the basis for the voluntary principles and all the progress the last 20 years in the VPs, I think, not just as the leading global human rights standard for extractives, but as a model for other multi-stakeholder initiatives in other industries. So it was a pleasure to have played this role 2 decades ago and to now reflect back and to see all the progress made. Thank you.
Edward, you're on mute.
Thank you for pointing that out. It would have been unfortunate to have a webinar without someone being on mute. It's unfortunate it had to be me. So, Bennett, you are the only representative of a governmental voice. And I'll come back to the points you were making about the balancing realizations from the companies and civil society in a moment. But one of the things that's always struck me as being important too was the role of the US and UK as home country governments in being willing to get involved in host country issues where that's required. I'm not sure that's always been followed up in the way it might have been, but could you talk a bit about that realization too? And you're on mute.
Very briefly, again, these were very early days for governments thinking about how to deal with conduct of multinational corporations, whether in extractives or other sectors, operating in different countries around the world. And there was an acute understanding that we had to respect the sovereignty of the countries where our companies were operating, but also an equally acute understanding that we needed to have US companies operating in some difficult places for a range of foreign policy, national security, and in the context of oil, energy security reasons at the time. This is before the climate agenda was quite as urgent and central, of course, as it's necessarily become. So this was not just a corporate responsibility and human rights initiative, although I conceived it initially as such. From the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department. It was also explicitly a foreign policy and national security initiative for the United States. And it was not coincidental that the three primary countries that were the VPs, what became the VPs, were most useful for at the time, Nigeria, Indonesia, and Colombia, happened to be several of the priority countries in US foreign policy to support, at the time, very fragile democratic transitions. So we saw this initiative from multiple perspectives of engaging the home country governments, the US, the UK, with host country governments, but to advance a range of interests, first and foremost human rights, but also to support civil society, human rights defenders, rule of law, better governance. There was a direct line between the VPs and the EITI. I was involved in early discussions with the Blair government in early 2002 about the lessons from the VPs and how the deeper governance issues that EITI came to address needed to be dealt with in a very serious global way as well. But I'll leave it at that for now, but just to emphasize at the time the crucial importance of home country governments stepping up here and understanding the dilemmas and quandaries faced by our companies dealing with host country governments and specifically security forces.
Great, thank you. I was waiting for the number of participants to click up before reminding people that we are recording this discussion, so it will be available on the website subsequently. And also, although I'll be asking the questions using the chat function, if as we go along people would like to interpose thoughts, please use the chat function and I'll then try and bring those considerations into the discussion. Arvind, you were a brave man back in 2000, albeit Bennett would have us believe you were young and rash as well. I wonder if you would like to talk a bit about how, from the civil society point of view, you viewed the risk-reward ratio implicit in the VPs.
Yeah, no, and thank you for hosting and moderating this today. I mean, I would go back to the late 90s and just remind everybody and point out that at that time there was no business in human rights. There was no recognition by the companies we were dealing with that there were any human rights responsibilities, and governments, for the most part, were pretty dismissive of the notion of asking companies to act more responsibly. And at the same time, we had just started focusing on this area of work. That's what I was basically hired to do at HRW. And within the course of about a year, in 1998 and 99, we did 3 reports on Enron in India and BP in Occidental in Colombia, and Shell in Nigeria, all of which were basically reports about how the companies had financial relationships with the police or military, and there were serious human rights issues surrounding them. And my thinking at the time, given that I was both new to HRW, where I was told you have a 6-month contract to figure out something on business and human rights or leave, and then we had these reports, and I'd spent several months in India doing some of the research and elsewhere, is that if you have the same problem in 3 different parts of the world with 4 different companies simultaneously, then your problem isn't really one of an individual company having an issue or low standards. There's something structurally wrong within the industry that needs to be addressed in the way security is provided. And just predating the discussions on the VPs, the World Bank had actually convened some of the oil companies, mining companies, and myself to kind of come up with guidelines. And some of the concepts that I ended up drafting for them at that time started feeding into the VPs. And there were certain things that we thought were quite important. Number one is, if you can identify the human rights risks ahead of time and mitigate them, we will be far better off in dealing with security issues than waiting for something bad to happen. And there are certain reasons why things happen. Secondly was, and I felt this was important, and this came out of discussions with companies, we had to get the security managers of companies in the room, because it was my belief at the time that the problem fundamentally came down to how people provide security. And if they thought a little bit differently about it and incorporated rights, you might see a different outcome. Because what we were seeing is security operations where the company viewed the surrounding community and the environment as a complete threat. And so they treated the surrounding environment as a threat. And for them, you know, you could clear the area of all life within a 5-mile radius and achieve the same exact result as having a good relationship with the community to make sure that you're not doing anything in a way that violates rights. So it was in that context where companies really didn't agree with us. I mean, Enron, for example, at the time, they came into our offices and provided a 20-page letter and a request for us to retract our reporting on their security problems. And we had to provide a 23-page letter showing them how they were wrong. And I'll give you an example of this. In one instance, we said that they were paying the police for security, and the security were going out and literally harassing, arresting, and beating people who opposed our projects. They said that was false. And I had to point out to them that actually came from the chief of police who they were paying, who told me they were doing this. And that was the environment in which Bennett, the US government, the UK government, and primarily Shell and BP initially, but not exclusively, started talking both with each other and to each other about putting together an initiative that would ultimately be the voluntary principles. And my view was, we need standards. That clearly this problem is not going to get solved until there's a common understanding of what the problem is and how to address it. And that wasn't just a new perspective for companies or governments, it was new for Human Rights Watch. I mean, people would ask me, why are you sitting down at the table with the US government and BP or Shell when you've written reports about them and you're so critical of them? And my basic view was, in an area without norms, you need to develop norms, right? And so we have to see where this takes us and see if it can achieve that objective. And I would say 20 years later, the one thing that the VPs can certainly point to is that it is the norm for this area of work. Where I would also look back after 20 years and say honestly is, I never thought the VPs would be the sole norm 20 years later. What I thought would happen was maybe 10 years after the VPs were founded, that if the entire or the major parts of the oil, gas, and mining industry, civil society, and key governments thought this was the right thing to do, then it would eventually turn into law. That, you know, that the risk assessment elements, that the disclosure of security agreements, and that the basic human rights principles that are part of the VPs would be the norm and would be enshrined in law in different ways. And I think, on the one hand, the VPs have done a really great job at socializing a norm and developing a norm. I do not think they have been the vehicle for enforcement of those norms, and I think we still have work to do. I think that there's, at this point, if you ask somebody, well, if every major oil company in the world, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, Human Rights First, every key human rights organization in the world, and major governments in the world all agree on a set of standards, then the obvious next question is, why isn't it law? And I think for me, back in 1999, I thought, okay, if we can all agree on this, then eventually it will be. It's just that has lagged behind where we hoped it would be. And I think we'll get there. But I also think that what it has taught me about multi-stakeholder initiatives is, like in many things, it is a process of negotiation and compromise. But there is an enormous value in setting baseline norms that everybody agrees on. So today, if you, Ed, or Bennett, or Justine, or Anton go into Exxon or Chevron or BP or Total's offices, and you say, let's talk about the voluntary principles and how are you implementing them, and things of that nature, nobody's going to look at you like as if you're an alien from another planet. They're going to know exactly what they have to talk about and what they're doing. And we've seen that over time. And they everybody understands the nature of risk assessment and analyzing security incidents and the like. So, and the World Bank, the IFC, applies these standards when it lends now, as we've seen in certain cases. So the value of creating a norm is enormous in today's world. And I would just remind people that some of the concepts that came out of the voluntary principles ultimately informed the UN guiding principles and others, namely the concept of due diligence and risk assessment. And it really just comes down to the basic idea that if you can identify a problem beforehand, you can prevent an abuse from happening, right? And that was kind of the core idea behind the VPs. What we also learned is that when it comes to security, and Bennett touches on this, this is one of those initiatives like maybe EITI or the Kimberley process where the companies needed governments to. And if you were going to have discussions about an army or a police force in another country, one clearly needs their embassy behind them in those discussions. So it was both a learning experience for me, just personally, professionally, but it was also an evolution for Human Rights Watch and a lot of human rights groups, because the concept of multi-stakeholderism really didn't exist in any meaningful sense then. Even with some of the signature campaigns of the human rights movement, like the landmines campaign or the cluster munitions campaign, it was largely a coalition of NGOs pushing and allying with like-minded governments and actors. But the concept that you would sit down with the people that you're investigating and the people that you're criticizing openly and regularly was new, and I would have to say met with a high degree of skepticism, not just by companies, but by people I worked with every day. But in the end, it would be hard to see how one could develop a set of norms that everybody would agree on without doing that.
Thanks, Arvind. Can I, so as not to cramp her perspectives, move on to Justine, with the human rights lawyers group being another key participant in the discussion. From your perspective, do you agree with Arvind's analysis? Were there other intensely skeptical pressures put on you in relation to getting involved in this process?
Thank you, Edward, and thanks to the VPs for putting this on. It's great to connect with everybody again. It's hard to believe that it was 20 years ago. I'm sure that we don't look any different from what we did 20 years ago.
Speak for yourself.
But it was and it's also hard to believe, given where we've come in 20 years, that this was such a radical idea. Some look different. I know I don't look any different. But this was, you know, this was a radical idea, and it's so not radical now, which is a good thing. And it was also, you know, it was bringing disparate groups together, but you know, it also wasn't all beer and Skittles. We didn't sit in a room and everybody say, isn't this great? We're all getting on and let's all agree. Even within the room, it was a real struggle. And there were very fiery discussions. As Bennett said, I was involved. And there was much yelling in rooms in those days. There wasn't exactly a meeting of minds, and people weren't easily coming to the idea or have the same purpose from the companies and the NGOs or the governments that were in the room. And so there was a healthy degree of skepticism, but there was a healthy degree of skepticism within the NGO community as well, and a schism, I would say, between those who thought that there was a time to engage and those who thought by engaging you were working with the devil, and that was then the end of you. So there was that, and to some extent that still exists, but much to a much lesser extent. But it was sort of, it was much more black and white in those days. You either engaged or you didn't, and you sat on the outside. And by engaging, then again, as I said, it didn't mean that there was agreement. It took a long time and many years to even, you know, with all these initiatives, to sort of have this gradual development of standards. What was important to us at the time, I think, was a realization that there was this really sector-specific set of issues that was going to be more effectively dealt with sector by sector. You know, 20 years ago, we weren't at a stage where something like the UN Guiding Principles was even a twinkle in the eye, that there would be this commonly agreed standard. And so for companies to come together, they felt very much that they needed to come together with their peers to deal with different issues that were relevant to extractive, as opposed to different issues that were relevant to apparel companies versus tech companies. And that was a useful way of starting discussions. And I think over the years, we'll see that some sectors were more amenable to moving further and faster than others. And the extractive sector was quite intransient and has continued to be in many ways still around issues around transparency and accountability. So what these initiatives were radical on were bringing together these groups, trying to get some establishment of norms, as Arvind said, but the norms very differently. And I think the struggle for the VPs in part has been this movement from awareness and agreement to a greater degree of transparency and accountability. And as we see the law moving faster now, I mean, it's 20 years, so human rights law doesn't move fast. But as we're seeing developments around the world to greater transparency in disclosure laws and human rights due diligence, these ideas around MSIs seem quite quaint, and thinking, well, that's all you're doing, you're achieving these groups coming together. But 20 years ago, just to get the people in the room was months and years of work. And so it was a start. We'll talk shortly about, you know, the limitations and how much further they've got to go. But it was, you know, it was considered radical from corporate perspective, from government perspective, and from an NGO perspective.
Thank you. Anton, companies had not only to think about their internal stakeholders, in particular, I think in the US side, what their lawyers were going to say about all this, but also your security people were having that interface with the people who provided you with the security. And so you were having to extent act as a buffer there. Can you tell us a bit about your perspective on this whole process?
Well, first of all, let me give tribute to the courage, foresight, wisdom of the people who got together and did something that was outstanding, remarkable, and ahead of its time. 20 years later, this is still in development, still in implementation. And I would therefore say it was late, but still ahead of its time. Secondly, I would say pick up a word that Arvind used to respond to your question, structurally. Where did this fit? We were dealing with a situation of retrofitting. And when you retrofit, the people who are already on board find new ideas, especially in a business like ours, very difficult because there's no budget for them. There is no training for them. There is nothing that was prepared for something like the VPs ahead. And therefore, to adjust the structure needed a lot of internal convincing. We were lucky in BP at that time that we had two things working for us. One, yes, there was a head of a security function who got it and was American and had the courage to take this forward. So that was very important. But the second very important point is we wanted at the time to make sure that the lessons learned by others and ourselves in the places that were mentioned would be applied in two very large investments that BP was about to embark on. One in Indonesia, and Bennett went later to do the first human rights impact assessment in Indonesia, in Tangguh. And the other was the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan in the Caspian Caucasus, a very difficult area, as we've seen in the last few weeks. And therefore, we really wanted to make sure that we have something that could be standard setting. And yes, we would be experimenting, but also experimenting on the side of less risk. So I would say that really helped a lot to overcome some of the, I think, considerations that you're just making. For existing operations, Edward, you're completely right. Those who are running a business and you come in and add something new, it becomes quite difficult. And this is therefore, I think my final point here would be the normative point that was made both by Arvind and by Bennett again. Today, we are no longer at a place where we have to retrofit for the new energy system that the world is creating. So the OECD countries are putting money on the table to change the way energy will be provided for the next 100 years. Should something like the voluntary principles be made into norms through an OECD process, and it's no longer a case of retrofitting, it's something that levels the playing field? I can see some difficulty and people arguing against it, but frankly, I see way more reasons why one should learn from this experience to get it right this time. I think the world, I wouldn't blame governments or civil society or business. That's the way the world had set up its energy system. We are where we are, but we're now on the brink of doing something different. And I think those who are going to pay for it, which is at the end European, American, Australian, New Zealand taxpayers, should be in a place where they sign off for something that is probably response to the call that was made 20 years ago. But yes, we are, the world was still of people wanting to fight rather than work together, and did not have the foresight that we have today. So I think the VPs, there are still many operations where it's being implemented as an initiative in a marvelous way, but still also places, and what comes to mind right now is northern Mozambique, where unfortunately the VPs are not being applied. And we see a form of security that resembles more the use of private armies than private security, unfortunately. And that should not be the case today. And we should have learned as a global population to do things better. So I'm very glad that you're creating this situation for a discussion, because we should not only be looking at the past, but actually this is current and we are at the brink of changing things. So let's have these active conversations. Thank you, Edward.
Thanks, Anton. And you're absolutely right about the Indonesia and the Ceyhan-Baku pipeline. And of course, around that time, we had the Chad-Cameroon pipeline too. So there were a number of major projects which helped to really embed the good practices. But Bennett, you presided over this process just as there was a change in administration in the US. How did you manage to keep, and I know you carried on personally with your involvement in this, keep up the momentum within both governments and companies and not losing faith in civil society?
Yeah. So thanks for that question, Edward. So I led the process entirely on behalf of the Clinton administration, which went out of business only on January 20, 2001. And we announced the VPs on December 20, 2000. So the entire initiative was conceived, negotiated, concluded, and announced in the last 2 years, really mostly the last year of the Clinton administration. That said, you know, I was apprehensive, as one might normally naturally be, in January of 2001, as I was facing the loss of my job, since I was a Clinton presidential appointee, a political appointee, as to what would happen. And for that reason, I spent a significant amount of time, my last several weeks at the job in January 2001, talking with the companies and the NGOs and the Foreign Office about nailing down the VPs so that they could survive some long transition and period of review and potential rejection even by the new Bush administration. I also reached out to the late Robert Davies, who was the founder and then the head of the International Business Leaders Forum, and also to the head of the BSR, to ask if they would informally be a co-secretariat pending some formalization of those roles on their part or somebody else, just to ensure continuity. And they instantly agreed to play those roles. It did take several months, I think the better part of 2001, for the State Department to take a review. And I remember sitting quite painfully in a luncheon with the Undersecretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, who was asked in front of a couple hundred people if the new Bush administration was going to carry on the voluntary principles. And he quite deliberately ducked the question. But the good news, and this is really the critically important point, is that the companies, not just the NGOs, saw the VPs as being very much in their interest. They saw very much the need for rules of the road, norms, standards, so that they could navigate really tough issues in tough places where they had to operate. And it was the companies who got to the Bush administration in 2001 and 2002, and I was particularly pleased that two U.S. companies, that one, Occidental Petroleum, that had been part of the original process in the first part of 2000, but then left, then came back in later in 2001 or early in 2002, and even more significantly that ExxonMobil, that had just become ExxonMobil, the merger of the two in calendar year 2000, had declined our repeated invitations to join the original process. Itself decided to join in 2002, and then of course put huge resources into implementation of the VPs. So it was ultimately the companies who saw the VPs as in their interest, and that was the persuasive argument, I think, with the Bush administration. One last quick point here related to the companies, and I just want to mention a couple of names of individuals who just played decisively important roles 20 years ago, and above all from the companies, David Rice of BP, Robin Arum of Shell, and David Lowry of Freeport-McMoRan. Those three individuals were believers from the beginning, and they helped carry through not only their own companies, but others, both on the US and the UK side. And I dare say that David Lowry of Freeport and David Rice of BP were very helpful when there was pushback in the last couple of months of 2000 as we were readying the announcement, that they stood up and they believed in this initiative as being in the interests of their companies and the whole industry and the communities where they were operating. So I just want to call out those names on the company side, in addition, of course, to Arvind and others, Justine, Salil Tripathi at the time with Amnesty International, who also played instrumental roles on behalf of the NGOs. But like everything we do, it takes a village.
Sure. Well, I wasn't there at the birth. I got involved probably 2-3 years later, but it was actually through a seminar that the International Business Leaders Forum had organized. And I remember going there and hearing about what companies should be thinking about human rights when I was working for Anglo American. A company with actually a good sense of its role in society. And it was revelatory in terms of where one should be thinking about the start and finish of corporate responsibility. So in some senses, what Justine and Arvind and Salil, I think you rightly call out as well, were challenging companies with was real, radical and important. On the other hand, in those early years, going to the plenaries, so often there appeared to be an awful lot of grandstanding around important issues, with one group of companies or one group of NGOs threatening to walk away. Do either Justine or Arvind want to say anything about those processes and why they were part of the natural birthing pangs?
Justine, do you want to say anything, or I'm happy to?
You go first.
I mean, I think it speaks to several things that were happening simultaneously. One, and probably the most fundamental, is the voluntary principles were launched as a set of standards, and there was no process underpinning them. So there was no secretariat, there were no rules on what it meant to be a member. There were no rules on compliance or reporting or anything of that sort. And I think that by virtue of being one of the first initiatives, I don't think we fully appreciated how important those elements would be structurally. So a lot of the disputes came out of that void, essentially, that the expectation of NGOs was that if you're going to sign on to this, and if you're going to have an annual meeting or something of that nature, then there should be some evidence that people are actually implementing these principles. That was coupled with the fact under the Bush administration that there was a push, and I think rightfully, to get more governments to join, but those governments had some issues too, like Colombia and others. So I think the threats, and the threats were actually acted upon. I mean, groups did leave, were largely a product of that vacuum of implementation and compliance that to some degree still exists today. And I think it was, to Anton's point, kind of trying to retrofit an implementation mechanism was a big underpin that dispute, because ultimately everybody had put in the time and effort to write standards in the hopes they would actually be used and implemented, and yet there was really no way to do that at the time. I don't know, Justine, if you have other thoughts on that, but that's kind of where I...
Yeah, I think that's right. And we ultimately were actually one of the groups that walked away at a point, because the early struggle, you know, there was this coming together of developing norms. But from the beginning, I think the voluntary principles had a really hard time in getting companies to accept any metrics or key performance indicators. And I would actually argue that that struggle's continued for the last 20 years. The early framework for the VPs, the core framework, I think didn't get it right at the outset, and has probably struggled to correct and undo those early assumptions for the last 20 years. And it was this real pushback against, yes, we'll agree on some standards, but we won't actually agree on a way to measure them and publicly report on them. And as the VPs were developing, there were other MSIs that started to, but there, you know, there is a really key question, you know, that they were in development 20 years ago. And I see Vicky has asked a question in the Q&A around where are they going to, you know, where are they developing? And I think that was an early struggle for many NGOs that, yeah, we want standards, that's radical, but then what are you going to do with those standards? And that's where we got immense pushback from companies that wouldn't agree to those agreements.
Edward, could I just make a quick comment here?
Very quick one, yeah.
Yeah, look, we didn't even convene the first dialogue that produced the voluntary principles in 2000 until March. And I was operating against the calendar of the American election. It was all we could do to put together the standards. Believe me, had I carried on or somebody else in a Al Gore administration, we would have put together a governance structure in 2001, 2002. The Bush administration didn't focus much on that until their second administration, and that was at the point where the criticism started to emerge. But I just want to say that we've learned lessons. That's why Tony Blair, as Prime Minister, announced EITI in the summer of 2002. It took 4 years then to actually structure EITI. That was direct learning from the VPs. And similarly, Arvind and I, along with Mike Posner, who was the founder and leader of Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, now Human Rights First, who was not part of the original voluntary principles process, but well aware of it, Justine, through you and me and others, why he and Arvind and I, among others, but not least among others, worked so hard as co-founders of GNI, the Global Network Initiative, to put together not only the normative standards, but the governance and accountability process. We spent all of calendar year 2009 just on that, after formalizing the principles themselves in 2008. So we did what we could at the time. We learned lessons that others in this industry through EITI and other industries like tech then applied from our experience. There's still more work for the VPs to do. That's a whole other discussion. But if I could have done it all over again, I would have had 2 or 3 years, and we would have collectively put together not only the normative, the norms, the principles themselves, but also the governance and accountability structure. But we did what we could at the time with the time we had.
Sure, and in politics, there being deadlines concentrates the mind. It might not have happened at all if you hadn't had that, perhaps. But Justine, you mentioned the question that came in from Vicky. Would you like to pick that one up?
Yeah, I think there was a question sort of saying that, 20 years ago, as we said, this was a radical idea, and, it was very much a process in development. But since that time, as all the panelists point out, there has been, and the establishment of the VPs did then influence the development of some of these other initiatives. MSIs in the last 20 years have sprouted, some good, some not so great. We've also seen the development of the UN guiding principles. But the question then is sort of, is the current form that we have still the right process, the right framework for these types of discussions? And I guess where I've come to over the years, because I've sort of been involved in them MSIs, but also been a critic of them. But there are some who say, there's no point for them at all. They need to go. And I'm not in that camp, because it feels that they have a purpose. But sometimes what people are trying to do is make them something they're not. And so for me, something like the VPs, what their virtue was the beginning of having these discussions, bringing these different and disparate groups and thinking together, ideally leading to greater transparency, leading to greater to change some mindsets, particularly some closed mindsets, which were more less likely to come from companies. But at the same time, there has to be this evolution of transparency and of monitoring of issues, and some initiatives have done that better than others. And so the question now is, how, what is their purpose? And I think they have a very good purpose in still developing standards, changing mindsets within a room, changing the way a company approaches a particular issue, particularly around security, which is so fraught in conflict zones. Are they an effective method of accountability and liability for companies? I don't think so. None of the MSIs that I'm looking at are a form of accountability. They have a different purpose, and I think that we have to look at them for what they can do, and not simply always look at what they can't do.
That's absolutely right and helpful. And I'm trying to keep track of some of the questions coming up a number of the questions are really forward-looking, and although we will go a bit into future horizon scanning, most of what we want to talk about today is what we've learned to date. You talked about metrics and reporting, and it took a long time, but my impression is that the VPs have, in as much as there are also issues, of course, around particular confidentiality, around detailed security arrangements, that they have largely met some of your objectives. Would you agree with that, Justine?
Probably not. In some cases, I mean, they've met some of the objectives in terms of this greater awareness raising. I think they've been very successful in many ways of familiarity, particularly with larger oil mining gas players. Not so much perhaps with SMEs in this space. They've also been much greater in promoting awareness around the problems of security. You know, as Arvind said, the reports that Human Rights Watch put out in the late 90s were very groundbreaking, you know, and then and it was that type of evidence was not commonly found. And now you see a lot more of these types of reports rolling out. But in terms of transparency and disclosure, my objectives, not so much, because I think now that we actually see some developments in law that are moving faster than still some companies involved in voluntary initiatives are willing to disclose. So I think there could be greater transparency, greater sort of measurement of performance in some of these MSIs. They should be, you know, law always lags, and so we're getting to a point where law is catching up, and I think that there's probably still a sprint that some of these initiatives could do to move faster.
Anton, in relation to internal security, my sense is that perhaps in the beginning, many security managers were cleaving to the old way of doing things, but there were a number of people who really helped break new ground. And I typically come across security managers these days who say, no, I don't want to be in the lead on this, I don't want to be on the lead on that. They see themselves as ultimately the court of last resort to an extent, and a belief in seeing how issues can be better understood, including underlying ones, and dealt with through other functions. Could you tell us a bit about that and how you think the security has evolved?
Yes, I think, Edward, thanks for that question. The VPs and then the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Companies, because indeed we had a baby here without teeth, and some teeth had to be grown. And the International Code of Conduct has grown a new generation of security people inside companies and in private security companies who understand the concept of human rights and are not threatened by it. And therefore, companies today recruit people who have been screened, who have been trained, who can work in this environment, who do not see the community as a threat, but actually see themselves as doing a better job if they have a community-based security model. And I think that is an outcome of this. Where, however, I think you're probably going here is the governance piece of security. And even with the limited definition that is out, coming out even within the, I speak from a European environment, definition of governance being very related to corruption and her sisters, the relationship between security and corruption is often very close. And governments are very much part of that conversation. Often the situations that arise in which companies and security and corruption are linked with the blessing of people in government, through patronage, to situations that are not very transparent. So going back to the normative question and how much durable contracting should ab initio contain principles similar to the voluntary principles with clear measurement, with clear disclosure, is the obvious answer. It is, should contracts be published? Should contracts related to security be published? I cannot see why not. You know, there's nothing to hide from the side of companies, of investors, to come clean. You know, today in the ESG world, which company wants to attract in the oil and gas industry or the mining industry serious investment without coming clean with regards to the way security will be held? The reasons why sometimes transparency is not possible is because sometimes people in government find it very difficult, because of patronage systems, that transparency comes in the way. So this is not to defend companies, but we need to, this is why multi-stakeholders initiatives, at least when they are operationalized on the ground, actually create spaces for dialogue, create spaces for creating trust, and creating spaces for progress to be made. I'm not disagreeing with Justin that in some places having a multi-stakeholder initiative to try and fix the world probably doesn't work. But in certain communities, in certain societies, it is groundbreaking to have a company sit with government, with security forces, from Ministry of Defense, from Ministry of Interior, and private security, and the complexity of civil society representatives, churches, etc. Multi-stakeholder initiatives are actually sometimes a very good tool to do something that normally doesn't exist, that people just barge on and move and think that artisanal miners, for example, are something illegal and should never be introduced in a discussion. So I believe that to answer your question fully, Edward, the security functions in companies, both mining and oil and gas, have come a very long way. And I would say today, in general, putting aside some bad experiences, Iraq happened, right? And Iraq didn't happen because oil and gas companies did it, but it happened because people wanted it. But it did create a certain dissonance at the time when the voluntary principles was still in its infancy. So I think we have omitted to refer to that situation. Bennett referred to the Bush administration. We had Iraq there, and that was very much trumped as a oil and gas war and voluntary principles. We who came to invest after that insisted on having voluntary principles as part of the technical services agreement that we signed with our Chinese partners and our Iraqi partners, ab initio, so that we could do security coming as close as possible to what we believe in. If it's not contractually there, it's very difficult to then get funding for it. It's very difficult then to hold an organization internally accountable, let alone externally. Thank you.
Interesting, and I think that those complexities were the sorts of things which, when I used to attend VP plenaries, were really useful to put on the table to understand actually how things work, as opposed to how theoretically they work. And the reporting that actually happened internally between the companies and the civil society groups was, I think, a useful educational process there. Now, I'm rather against wanting to demonize Chinese companies, but to an extent, Bennett, have we managed to move the VPs in the absence of what Arvind was saying earlier, because it hasn't become law, they're norms? Are they still basically norms that are in the minds of Western companies? To what extent have we been able to move the debate on?
Not enough, not nearly enough. That said, there have been, some glimmers of progress, or at least hope, and some going back at least a dozen years. I remember Edward Sir Mark Moody Stewart, who you worked closely with when he was non-executive chairman at Anglo American, and we all know from his prior role as chief executive of Shell, undertook an initiative in conjunction with the UN Global Compact in the mid-2000s to start to talk to companies operating in Sudan and Darfur and about the use of the voluntary principles. I do remember that quite clearly from over a dozen years ago. I also recall, and this is just anecdotally, but 5 or 6 years ago being approached at the UN Annual Forum in Geneva, UN Annual Forum of Business and Human Rights, by a Chinese national employee of the International Committee for the Red Cross, China, to have a very detailed discussion of the VPs, and the Chinese government was not at the time, or apparently since, interested in joining formally, but she was telling me that the VPs were quite well known among Chinese oil companies as a risk management standard. So there's just, I think one of the tremendous limitations of the VPs is that they've been socialized as the global norm, mostly for Western companies. But that's probably has changed to some extent. I'd like to think that they're used by companies based in other parts of the world. I would still love to see Global South companies, not just governments and civil society, but companies in the VPs. There are such significant global players in both the mining and oil and gas sectors for which the VPs would be, I think, very useful. Human rights, of course, is the phrase in the VPs, is a stumbling block at the official level for China in particular, and that probably won't change for the foreseeable future. But the extent to which the VPs can be explained to that government in particular and to others as the global norm for risk management for companies operating in conflict zones with security forces, I think that may be a more open door to push on. But in this next decade, I think one of the great opportunities and challenges for the VPs is to try to become a more fully global, not just norm, which it already is, but the focus of global practice. And that's going to mean going to Global South companies and governments in a concerted, strategic way.
Thanks. And there's a note in from our old friend and colleague in this process, Claude Voila from ICRC, saying work on socializing Chinese stakeholders and VPs is continuing right as we speak through an act like CCCMC, and shows quite some interest. So there's some hope there. Now, there's also been some exchange, including a note from Eduardo Martin dos Santos from Total around Mozambique. If we were set up in a different way, Eduardo, I'd willingly give you the floor, but that's quite difficult given how we've configured it. I hope you can carry on a dialogue direct with Anton around that topic in northern Mozambique, and I understand the work you're doing. Can I, though, in the remaining half hour, focus really on 2 points? First of all, and briefly, without everyone just getting their fingers ready to point at others, to think about the pillars that each of you have represented and where you think enough has been done or more could have been done in different ways. And I might start with you, Arvind, since you haven't had a slot recently.
I mean, there's some things we couldn't have really understood at the time, like putting in an infrastructure for the VPs at the outset, because I don't think that's where we were. I think, though, in one way or another, what we're describing is all kind of part of the same issue, which is that a multi-stakeholder initiative ultimately is not an enforcement mechanism. And from a civil society perspective, I have found that a lot of the company reporting within the VPs is quite useful and quite candid and quite open. But I also find myself thinking that it is reporting for the people inside the VPs, and for those companies that are outside of it or who don't have an incentive to be part of it, it's a different animal. So I think from a civil society standpoint, what is happening now is probably something that could have happened earlier, which is pushing for mandatory due diligence laws and the like. What would be ideal is if the VPs and all its members saw the norms as the right norms to be pushing collectively to see them institutionalized in different ways. And I don't just mean by law, I mean by incentivizing companies to do the right thing. So in a different context, we actually called for tax credits and financial incentives on the part of government for companies to implement human rights standards, make it cheaper to do the right thing. And you could do that with financial institutions and the like. So I feel like where civil society is going is to push to embed norms into more enforceable avenues. And I think that's something we could have probably done earlier. But I would also say, and I know you said not to finger point, but I would just point out that a lot of these disputes ultimately come down to what do governments want to do, right? So it's entirely predictable to expect that some companies will say we never want regulation, and it's entirely predictable to expect that civil society will, for obvious reasons. Ultimately, it comes down to the will of the people who actually control militaries and police forces and the like to decide what they expect from companies and what kind of conduct do they expect, and to institutionalize that in countless different ways, not simply through what a secretariat looks like, but also how they incentivize things. So for example, with forced labor, you've seen the US government in the last days of the Obama administration put in rules about who they would contract with depending on how they deal with forced labor around the world, right? So I think we also have to accept that if we want the VPs to be more than a club and to be the thing that everybody feels they have to do, then we're going to have to incentivize it differently. And we're going to have to see governments, more so than companies or civil society, really take on that role.
We've talked about the VPs as a norm and your expectation that within 20 years, more of it might have appeared in law. Have you been disappointed by the limited extent to which the VPs have been used as soft law in litigation? Arvind?
I mean, I think the development of law has been slow. What I've seen is that where companies and institutions like the World Bank have decided to use the VPs as the baseline to assess a particular situation, it happens. But I think governments have been very slow to regulate generally and slow to deal with these issues specifically. And I think if I have, you know, my biggest disappointment is probably that, is that society didn't evolve as fast as I thought it would be. But I don't think that's unique to the VPs. I think that's a persistent issue that has come up, that only in the last few years we started to see changes with the due diligence laws and disclosure laws coming up around the world.
Sure, and I think in terms of due diligence, you're seeing quite a lot of activism now. Justine may want to add on that around due diligence laws.
Yeah, I mean, it's both been slow and fast. In terms of 20 years ago, you look at it and say, would we be in a situation where we're still discussing, you know, what laws would apply when? I mean, 20 years ago, I couldn't anticipate law was going to be involved really at all at times. I mean, we were at the same, you know, around the same time we were debating the UN norms, and that blew up, you know, fairly quickly in many ways, trying to get some international law, and that debate now has started again really 20 years later and is still ongoing. So there is a lot of advancement now. And I think part of that key is, as Arvind said, is that governments have come back into the picture. So the action in the EU around mandatory human rights due diligence, national laws, particularly on issues like modern slavery and forced labor in the UK, Australia, France, government is re-engaging. And I think particularly at this time of the establishment of the BPs, there was a tendency for government in some sectors to really step aside and say, well, we're not going to be involved in this business. And this particular initiative was different because it had government, and it needed to have government because of the way the sector works at the table. But there was a whole period of the late 90s, early 2000s where government was on the outside and there was this regulatory vacuum. And that's where some of these initiatives came in. And so people saw them as this, we're going to solve everything. And at the same time, I think there's still a tendency for some people to see as law as saving everything. And as a lawyer, I say, well, that is just simply never going to happen. I mean, law basically does advance issues, it solidifies norms, it's very useful like that. But the US has had the Voting Rights Act since the mid-1960s. And look at that mess that's still going on in some ways with sorting out those issues. Law is a really important player, but law is one of many players. And so I think it's very important for law to formalize things like transparency and due diligence. But the key of these types of initiatives is if you're going to make them happen on the ground, you have to engage business because they are the ones then implementing that. And if there's a law and business are resistant, they will find a way to get around it. So the idea of these types of initiatives is to basically have civil society there as their conscience and more than that, and say, keep pushing them, saying it's not enough, you've got to do more. But it's all those picks, they're all part of the puzzle. Government, business, NGOs, law, soft law, hard law, it has to work together.
Can I add, Edward, could I just jump in on that? Because I think that
Sure.
Justine makes a really important point. And I would actually add two things. One is if there is ever a law that kind of incorporates the VPs, then the VPs as a process kind of becomes where the leading edge of companies become, right? It evolves beyond the law, which is a good thing. But the other thing I would say is, even though we say the VPs should have evolved into law, and I firmly believe that, I also believe that something like the UN Guiding Principles would not have existed in the form they do without the VPs and the Fair Labor Association and some other initiatives having set out those standards and structures. So I think as much as we might look at the VPs as a transitional body or a transitional phase towards something harder, it also is the foundation on which a lot of the modern concepts of what company responsibilities are. And we should, so it, as a norm, it also heavily influenced what we take for granted now.
Yeah. Edward, if I could just nail this, hit this right on the head. It was Arvind, together with Chris Campanovo of my team at State, who drafted that risk assessment section right after the preamble, the first substantive section of the VPs. They drafted that in June, July of 2000. A straight line from that to the first ever HRIA, commissioned by BP in late 2001, that Gare Smith and I had the opportunity to do for Tengu. A straight line to the whole world of mandatory due diligence, just as Arvind points out in the Ruggie framework. And I was not alone in spending significant time with John Ruggie and his team in the mid to late 2000s as they developed the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework, but emphasizing in particular toward the end of his first mandate from 2005 to 8, the critical importance of human rights due diligence in general and human rights impact assessments in particular. The VPs were the forerunner, and I really think it's important for people involved in the initiative 2 decades later to understand that for all the limitations of the VPs, that they were the innovator in the field of human rights due diligence. The FLA pointed the way in some respects, but the VPs had an explicit section right up front about human rights due diligence. And that doesn't mean it's story over, hardly. But this was the baseline expectation that this initiative set 20 years ago.
Sure. Bennett, can I ask you just to go back to the other question I was looking at, which is governments collectively, what should they have done differently as one of the pillars?
Well,
what could they have done better? What could they?
Yeah, a lot. And I was quite outspoken, I think it's fair to say, both publicly and also privately in the 2000s and very early 2010s, but I've been pretty silent on this the last half dozen years. It was sort of enough already. But I have long felt that there was inconsistent and at times inadequate focus by the home country governments. It's varied over the years, and I don't have a clear sense of it now. I am hopeful, though, that the U.S. role will be revitalized with the new Biden administration. But I remember doing a paper at Wilton Park, sitting next to John Ruggie at the outset of his mandate in October 2005, making the observation literally 15 years ago that the weakest link in the VPs was that between the home country and host country governments. And I still think that I don't want to call it a weak link now because I'm not sufficiently informed on the status of the current process. I know there's been huge progress with some governments, host country governments, but I am certain that that is a link that can and should be strengthened. And it's especially important to bring in South country, both home and host country governments formally into the process to the extent necessary, possible, but if not officially, then at least operationally to bring them in. So that's where the government role is absolutely critical, as well as in still trying to bridge differences as we did 20 years ago between the other two pillars, the companies and the NGOs. So, these MSIs have different configurations. Some don't have governments in them at all. The FLA initially had the US government, but then walked away almost 20 years ago. GNI we put together, sorry about the acronym, Global Network Initiative, entirely without governments. EITI does have governments, but the role of the governments, both home and host country governments in the VPs, is absolutely intrinsic to the entire initiative, and it really should be strengthened further. I just won't be too specific about that, having not followed it as closely the last several years as I did in previous years.
If I may add a point.
Thank you. Just a moment, Anton. I'll come to you in just one moment. I just wanted to refer to 2 points that have come in on the chat and ask if the Secretariat, in particular, who are silent participants in this, would pick up a question from the Embassy of Colombia about links between the VPs and the Canadian Ombudsman Service, and also around bringing in more host nations. And I think that again is dealt with best by the Secretariat offline. Anton, I wanted to ask you whether there are ways in which you think companies have used the VPs well, or other ways they should have played their cards better.
I think companies have used the VPs well, because considering where we are today, there's been a lot of implementation. And we all know around the circle, and many of our listeners are representatives of companies who have invested a lot in this process. But as we said initially, this is a retrofix. And there's one thing putting money on the table. It's another thing putting political capital. And referring back to the previous conversation, what is the role of some of the government in the corporate pillar, in the government pillar of the VPs? I often find in certain embassies of some of the members of the government pillar that there's complete ignorance about the fact that their own governments are part of this process, and therefore are unwilling to put the political capital to help the home governments. They don't need to join the VPs if they don't want to, but to be able to contract, to issue mineral development rights, to issue PSAs that have 2 principles. When we read laws, we find that laws can be reparative or preventative. And there's nothing in the VPs that is contrary to the concept of it preventing human rights violations or repairing situations where situations have led to human rights violations. So I see that there is a role, not so much to get governments to sign up to make a big declaration, but actually to be able to negotiate contracts with foreign investors, not just in the oil and gas, but across sectors. There are many other industries that hire security. And let's be open about this. So this should not be something only about the extractives. should also be about transitional, therefore, forms of energy. Why should it only be extractive? Why should a hydroelectric plant not have the same concept? It doesn't make sense. But governments, particularly the representatives of governments that are members of the VPs, should at least be able to switch on and put some political capital and help governments to on the home side to negotiate, even within the context of bilateral investment treaties, etc., that sometimes protect investment, and they should protect investment, but protect investment in this way. Property rights are best protected when they are well invested. Of course, arbitration is very important, litigation is very important. These are good exercises of protection of property rights. But the best way to protect the rights of investors and those who hold property is to invest properly. And the VPs, at least from this aspect, prevent human rights violations and hence potential litigation and potential causes for communities to put pressure on governments to undo some of the agreements. So when we see governments behaving in a nationalistic fashion, sometimes communities are in support of that because they have been brutally treated, because they have been forgotten, because they came with something small and they were ignored. And when they came with something bigger, then they asked whoever populist came into government to clean the slate. And of course, sometimes governments end up running mines or oil and gas installations, which shouldn't be their role. They should be, of course, doing something that which is called governance and not trying to do extractive. So going back to your question, Edward, I believe we need to join up things and broaden to, as Vicky was, I think, Vicky Bowman put a very good question. Why should, in this day and age, 20 years later, still speaking about extractives? It doesn't make sense. We need to just look at now the energy transition, but go beyond that. And that's I think, where we need to be. Thank you.
Let me ask you one more question, because I think this is really important in terms of the legacy of the VPs and the challenge going forward. In your experience, how rigorous is enforcement of the VPs by the companies that take part?
It depends on the risk. In those places where the risk is very high, companies equip themselves with the best people, and the rigor is outstanding. So I've seen operations in the company I used to work, which is VP, and in other companies where the performance was way ahead of its time. Then you visit other operations where people consider that there is no risk and therefore the standard is lower. Because of course we were retrofixing. So go back to my same point, where do people put the main emphasis? They put the main emphasis where the risk is, because there is no level playing field outside, and therefore when you're competing, you need to therefore be very, look at your advantage and focus on those areas where you're most exposed. So I've seen very good performance in some areas. I've seen that companies probably have missed some things because at that time the risk was not recognized or not well understood. If at the front end the risks are not well studied, the schedule of a project misses the funds, the resources to address an issue when it pops up. Most projects are done in a very linear fashion, but here we're dealing with risks that are non-linear. So unless in the front end side of engineering, one has had the foresight to prepare for the unexpected, and sometimes people believe that this risk will not appear, and therefore it will be underfunded. So when people are investing in certain parts of Europe, they think that this is not something that will occur. But there is violence in Europe. People believe that everything is rules-based. No, it's not everything is rules-based. So these are situations where we need to think in advance. And hence I would say in the new energy investments that we're doing across the world, but particularly in the developed world, why not? Why is security not even considered. When I ask people about, is security part of the investment decision that concerns wind, solar, etc. in developed countries, there's no discussion of security because it's not even considered a risk. And therefore it's not part of the conditions that host governments give. They speak about tariffs, they speak of many other sophisticated issues, but security is not sophisticated enough, which is, in my view, a big contradiction with the learning that we're discussing today.
Thank you. You made some really important points there, and I think potentially also to add to the list of things for discussion at the forward-looking webinar be taking place in 2021. But we have limited time left now. Could I ask the other three panelists, just in closing, to think, what do you think we have achieved over the last 20 years? And also to address the issue of why not more VPs? Just for the moment, let's stick to the extractive sector. We've had VPs, we've had the EITI, we've had OECD responsible sourcing, but frankly, there are also a number of other very granular issues where there's a need to build greater consensus. What do you think we've achieved, but what could we have done better? And Justine, since I'm looking at you, would you like to start?
Sure. I think, well, I guess in terms of achievements and success, some ways when you look at something like the VPs or other MSIs, if everybody is unhappy with where it's at, in some ways that's a success. Because the companies feel like that they're being pushed too far. The NGOs feel like you're not going enough. The outside, the governments are unhappy. And if everybody's very comfortable in an MSI, that's never a good thing. Because it's meant to be a vehicle where you are, even if inching forward, you are incrementally making some change. And the VPs in that way, with lots of unhappiness from different sectors, can sometimes, that means that's been a useful thing. I think we sometimes can get caught up so much in the journey that we forget there has to be an endpoint. Companies forever, in every sector, are talking about their journey they're on. They're never on a journey to profit. That's always very quick. But the journey to human rights is a very long and winding road. And I think at times with the extractive industry, sometimes we've lost sight of what is actually the end goal here. Where are we trying to get to? Not just so busy working on where we're going to. So I think that's important. So, but there has been, as we're looking back in 20 years and, people say, well, that's not enough. I mean, the fact that we actually started this discussion 20 years ago seems quaint, but it was significant then. It did bring these players together. For things like what Anton was talking about, determining risk. 20 years ago, risk was very much the sole province of the company. Now we've got a point to where a company has to think about, well, how do I perceive risk, but how do you perceive risk? What does the NGO say about risk? What do the workers, what do the community say about risk? Then that has been quite an achievement. And that's not for all companies. Many companies are still doing this internally. But in this sector, there is a broader discussion about bringing other people in to determine things like risk and making human rights a part of those mainstream discussions. So I'm definitely in the camp that there is a long way to go, but I'm not in the camp that we haven't, that we haven't achieved anything. And I think my role is if everyone's a bit unhappy, then that's pretty much a good thing.
An equality of unhappiness. Thank you very much. And in particular for bringing us back to that point, which I think is at the core of the guiding principles about the assessment of risk and the assessment of what the risk that companies can form to those around them. And I think that has been a major change in the way a lot of companies have been looking at risk in recent years. Arvind, final comment?
Yeah, I think I would just build on Justine's and say, if you look today, think about all the things everybody agrees on. So everybody agrees that companies have human rights responsibilities. Everybody agrees that people should follow the voluntary principles. And I think we're at a point where the real discussion now is how do you ensure everybody does it? And I'm not talking about the VP's members, I'm talking about more generally. And so if we can point to one accomplishment, is that we're all starting from the same foundation and the same baseline. And now the real discussion is, how do you make it more effective, more institutionalized, and apply more broadly to a broader range of institutions than just the ones that took a risk 20 years ago to try to start this. And that's not a bad place to be. I mean, in many ways, if what you're talking about is how to do something as opposed to whether to do something, you're probably in a better situation. But there's a lot of how still left to do that I think we have to focus on as well.
Thank you. Bennett, final comment from you.
Yeah, thanks. Look, there's plenty to be critical of. Any multi-stakeholder initiative that doesn't have the capacity for self-criticism, in my view, loses its legitimacy. The VPs, in my view, still have a ways to go on transparency and accountability, and their credibility, the VP's credibility, will be limited to the extent that they don't, in my view, enhance transparency and accountability. But let's, on this 20th anniversary, really focus and end on what the accomplishments are. And I think, looking back, there's three fundamental ones, a line each. The first is that we came together, we listened, we learned, we understood, accepted, and respected mutual bottom lines around security and human rights, disparate actors, converging interests, commitments. Second, we laid the basis for contemporary human rights due diligence, which is now front and center in every industry there is in the global economy. No small achievement. And last and not least, and the hardest to measure, the hardest to prove, partly because I think of the still inadequate transparency and accountability, but also just because it's always difficult to prove a negative, is just think what the VPs have really done. They have protected rights and saved lives. Protected rights and saved lives in countless situations around the world. And that is a tribute to the companies, the NGOs, the governments, the three pillars who've taken forward this bold, innovative initiative that a number of us put together 2 decades ago. You've carried it forward. You have protected rights and saved lives. And this work is more important and more urgent in more countries than ever before, 20 years on.
Thank you very much for all your observations, panelists. I think it's been a really rich discussion. I think you also, as many of you were involved at the birth, have some cause for pride. Critically, at the process level, yes, what has been developed through dialogue and through practice has been very influential in areas like the guiding principles, like human rights due diligence, and through building consensus between the parties has helped that process. But I also go back, I think, given my own experience, that the change in mindset, the move away from confrontation and the risk that local people become collateral damage has been greatly diminished. And the VPs, I think, has a lot to thank for that. So thank you all for your contributions today. I hope that we can capture some of the key comments you've made. And thank you for the last 20 years for your commitment. And thank you to the Secretariat for allowing us to have this trip down memory lane. Thank you.